Today I'm sitting on my floor because I can't find my stool. And this is going to be the shortest long video that I've ever made because I have to be somewhere later. TBRs suck, and that's not to be divisive. In my opinion, TBRs suck. They suck for me because they require so much commitment. And during the last month, a book on my shelf that was just an ordinary book and I passed it by every day, decided it was going to become a beguiling book and gave me a sidelong glance and was like, come on, open me, you want to. And I wanted to, so whatever, I follow my whims, because I feel like there's so much that we commit to, like externally determined sort of rules that we have to stick to in life, and there's no avoiding them. And then that's fine, but then there has to be some other areas, like our hobbies, for example, that we just are able to just follow our whims and be more free. And reading is that for me. It's not like a competitive thing for me, even though I'm doing YouTube now. I don't like the idea of like very rigid goals for my reading. If you're thinking about something, to read books around whatever you happen to be thinking about that month, that just makes sense. Anyway, rant over. This is my June wrap-up. Belated, unfortunately. I wanted to finish this book, and that's what made me really late, because I wanted to discuss this book in this video. Matter 210 by Hwang Sok-Yong. It is the star of the month, but I'm going to leave it for later. So the first book that I finished this month was In This Together by Marianne E. Krasny, and it was absolutely a good read. It was everything that it was probably intended to be. It's certainly well-intentioned, I've no doubt about that, and it really is. Marianne E. Krasny is doing work that needs to be done. However, I felt that the tone of the book was a little bit too calm given the urgency of the climate crisis, and there's a place for that, because with some people the approach has to be very gentle. I get that, as some people don't like to be shoved out of their comfort zone and they become very resistant. But it felt like Krasny is herself 71, I think, and it felt like a grandmother. Maybe she even reads for the audiobook. I listened to the audiobook. It felt very calm and very comforting and very like patting on the back. There. We're in a climate crisis, but don't push yourself too hard. And I felt like that might backfire if you... she's supposed to know her stuff because she's a professor in civic ecology and she specializes in communicating information about climate change and the environment. Maybe she's just onto a good few things more than I am, and that would make sense. I'm sure she is, in fact. But it felt like, from my perspective, I guess I'm not the target of the book. I felt a little bit too easy, a little bit too rose-colored almost. Like, I do believe in what she is arguing, which is the core of the book is really premised on this idea that individual action really matters. It is critical because the accumulative effect of individual action, when social change kind of starts very small and insignificant, and it doesn't seem like there's any way at all that the change can come about, but sort of increment by increment, it ripples through a population and it gets to a sort of a tipping point. And to be fair to Marianne Krasny, she does sort of touch on the political and economic and cultural substructure of our society that is complicit in climate change, but she doesn't really delve any deeper than as deep as she should, in my opinion. And I feel like glossing over that could be a mistake with many people, because there is this resistance to the idea of criticizing capitalism itself, as was capitalist realism, and an inability to even realize that we're living in a capitalist society. The book is a fairly broad inventory of actions that normal individuals can take to be part of the movement to mitigate climate change. So they include things like joining a non-profit organization that fights for the environment or for new policies, letter writing to your local politician, even picking up litter. The book is what it is. It is kind of like an inventory, and a smorgasbord maybe, and you choose the stuff that works for you. It's for a different audience than me, probably. And I do believe in this idea that, there's nothing mightier than the majority who realize their mightiness. The challenge is in getting the majority to be on the side of mitigating climate change, and then to believe in their own power. And it's about really convincing them that their individual actions do collectively amount to something that is more powerful socially than anything else. Metaphorically speaking, like Mount Everest is made up of lots of dead creatures from under the sea over millions of years. A very mighty, large thing made up of tiny, tiny little parts. But then the flip side of that metaphor is that it took so goddamn long to make Mount Everest. Similarly, social change is a really, really slow process, generally speaking. I suppose the way that you stay sane and keep acting is to focus on your locality and hope that people all over the world in their localities are focusing on that, because it becomes much more achievable to envisage a small area that is, say, primarily plant-based, or using public, or has like better recycle lanes or whatever. These things do matter. They're not enough, but they do matter. You can also go further and say local economies that are functioning in an anti-capitalist way. But like that, I haven't seen any examples of that, but just hypothetically, right? And if that happens in every locality, every reasonable goal, right, in those localities, all of those together become what? Like global or widespread examples of, people not driving cars anymore, eating primarily plant-based, or not using any fossil fuels or whatever, right? So it does matter. So I gave the book 3 out of 5. Look, I consider myself to be an Ursula K. Le Guin fan, and I think unquestionably she's written many good books, but this just wasn't one of them. And the sting of disappointment was all the stingier because I went into this book with great expectations. I'm considering myself to be an environmentalist, and this book is dealing with, it seemed to me like an allegory for colonialism and environmental destruction, and how the fight of indigenous peoples against the colonizing invader. And I just thought that's the kind of stuff I really like, and it has so much potential in a sci-fi context. But unfortunately, that's all true, and it is an allegory, but unfortunately the delivery just fell short for me. Honestly, it felt like an assignment, a university assignment, that it felt like it was something that she wrote a long time ago when she was very young, and she hadn't really developed her writing skills, and she'd been out partying for the 3 nights prior, and now this assignment was due, and she just threw it together, neglecting to edit it, and this was the result. Kind of, that's what it felt like. It felt like shoddy and a little bit amateurish, and just not up to the standard that I expect of Ursula K. Le Guin. To be fair to the book, it is a short book. It's like you read it in a few hours. It's got some really interesting ideas that, had they been given more space, might have developed into something more interesting, like the way that dreams function in the Athshean, who are the indigenous people of the planet, actually, that the humans are invading, how the dreams function in their culture, the role that they play, and also their beliefs around that, and their conception of their world being, the primary matter of their world being forest, as opposed to like earth, the way that we would think of our world being primarily composed of earth. As for the characters, I would say that the main Athshean character was the most compelling of them all. Again, not terribly multifaceted. There just wasn't even the space for it, I suppose. Some of the behaviors, the choices of the characters seemed a little bit off to me, but he was making difficult choices in having to defend his people and his planet. I would say that the villain was one of the most cartoonish villains that I've read in a really long time in an adult book, and seemed actually like it was created by a child, like a baddie, because he was completely unsympathetic and seemed one-dimensional. And then the good human wasn't much better, because just he was a bit of an oaf, to be honest, not in a way that seemed intended. Maybe it seemed like a clumsy characterization of a person who is suffering from internal conflict. There's one passage, for example, I think it's the opening passage in the opening chapter for that character from his perspective, where there's a bit of stream of consciousness while he's having a migraine. And it just was such a flop for me. It just, if I compare it to other writers' stream of consciousnesses that they've included in their books, it just seemed amateurish, to be honest, like a first attempt almost, and just not edited, like not crafted, just spewed out kind of. And that was kind of disappointing for Ursula, for someone of her stature, So to summarize, I think that this book had great potential in terms of the concepts, but unfortunately the execution just, I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. The third book that I read last month was Funes the Memorious by Jorge Luis Borges. And it's the first book, or first short story, first piece that I read by Borges. And the reason I picked it up was I was reading another book on neuroscience, and they were discussing in that book the importance of being able to forget, for the brain to be able to distinguish superfluous information and forget it. And in Borges' story, Funes the Memorious, Funes actually loses his ability after an accident. He loses his ability to selectively forget, and he remembers everything. And so the protagonist recounts his interaction with Funes, and how Funes kind of starts to decline into madness, and he sees the world entirely different, and he sees it as a superpower, and he gets very dissatisfied with our decimal system of numerals, and how there's a repetition of like 6s and 8s and whatever right through, and he thinks every number should have its own unique name because he can remember everything now, so he sees things very differently. And so he starts to work, starts the impossible task of renaming all of the numbers, and things like that. Like his perspectives just starts to be very different, and he remembers everything from like any incident that happens to him, like the taste of things, the smells and everything. He remembers it all, and he becomes mad eventually. So I thought, from the perspective of somebody interested in brain science, it was interesting. It was suitably short because my literary mind found it to be very dry and unemotional, and I don't think I would have been able to sustain interest. If it had stayed like that, I wouldn't have been able to sustain interest much longer. I would have preferred to read like a scientific paper than read about that phenomenon through a narrative like that was that dry. And I'm interested though to read other Borges stories now, longer works perhaps, and I gave it 3 out of 5 just because, it stopped where it should have stopped. It was very, very short, quick read, read it in maybe an hour, if even, and it covered what it was wanting to explore. The fourth book that I read was Kohei Sato's Slow Down, what's the subtitle? How Degrowth Communism Can Save the Earth. But no, don't be afraid of the C word. Don't run away, because it's very likely that you are thinking of totalitarian states and Soviet Russia, for example. But in actual fact, the communism envisioned by Marx and Engels was anything but totalitarian. Is quite the opposite. And in this book, Kohei Sato argues Marx, actually near the end of his life, departed from this idea of historical materialism and kind of like growth, right? Capitalistic growth, that he began to believe that this was not viable as a long-term economic structure. And this finding, so to speak, of Kohei Sato and some other academics is supposed to help, sort of like Marx has his back for this new kind of communism that he wants to put forward, this sort of green communism. But really at the root of the argument is that Sato is saying that capitalism itself is incompatible with reducing emissions and the use of natural resources, finite natural resources. And that SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, as outlined by the UN, are like a band-aid. They are completely impotent when it comes to affecting any real necessary changes to fight climate change. He actually describes it as akin to taking the blue pill, like as in the Matrix, and Neo chooses the red pill. SDGs are the blue pill. Ideas like the new Green Deal, he gives them short shrift. He doesn't really think that they are really seeing the problem, the real problem. And the reasons for this are that he sees growth as inherent to capitalism. And if you're following the basic tenets of capitalism, growth is a necessity for the maintenance of the system. And he also draws on different evidence to show that decoupling is impossible. And when I say decoupling, I mean decoupling economic growth from the depletion of the natural world, whether it's the resources or the emission of planet warming gases. He also argues that it is paradoxical to argue for degrowth capitalism, that you cannot have a degrowth capitalism. It is an impossibility. Capitalism depends on growth for its own survival. And so the answer that we should be choosing, the red pill, so to speak, Sato argues, is degrowth communism. And so early on in the book, he uses that quadrant, political quadrant thing, like more state power and less state power, and more equality and more inequality on poles. He argues that we have 4 options, one in each quadrant, and that the result of climate change can lead to climate fascism, which would be a situation where the state has a lot of power and there's a lot of inequality, or barbarism, where there's basically kind of the culmination of a free market under climate change, where there's very little state power but gross inequality, or climate Maoism, where the state takes control of everything and we live in an authoritarian situation where maybe our emissions come down, but it's because of draconian laws and very little freedom, and basically totalitarian states. And then, of course, the last option being degrowth communism, where there's weak state power, but also much higher levels of equality, where, the means of production are owned by the workers, the normal people. And basically we share the resources and we manage them together. And then the book goes into, that's early on in the book, and it goes into why he characterizes that particular mode of governance and explains why that would be the best hope that we have to create a stable climate for the future. So that's enough exposition for that. I think I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I got a lot out of the book. Can I say I'm 100% convinced of everything he says? No, I'm not equipped to, and I'm not sure that anybody is equipped to be certain of that, but I certainly find it very intriguing. And I found that it kind of shifted me a little bit away from, quite a lot actually, away from anarchism. This is something that's been happening for me for the last year or so, away from anarchism towards communism. Is that a dangerous thing to admit on the internet, potentially? All theoretical, of course. I'm thinking of maybe doing an in-depth review of this, and so we can really chew on the ideas that are outlined in it and argue about them and their feasibility. So if you are interested in a review on Slow Down, then just leave me a comment below and I will get to work on that. This was the last book that I finished last month, but actually technically this month. And it was the only hard copy book that I read. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. It is a masterpiece. I think it deserves that title. It is written by Hwang Sok-Yong, Matter 210, as you can see. It was nominated for the International Booker Prize, and rightly so, because I haven't read Kairos, which won the International Booker Prize this year, but it must be hella good if it surpasses this one. This one is set in Korea over a long period of time, mostly over the 20th century. It's a kind of a family saga that follows different generations, but really centers on, I guess, 2 generations mainly. And one in kind of sort of the middle of the book, and then intermittently throughout the book, a contemporary member of the family who is a working class, Gino is his name. He's a working class citizen of South Korea, and he is protesting atop a chimney stack in order to have they were mistreated. He and his colleagues were mistreated and wrongly laid off by a company, a heavy industries company, and they are looking to regain for justice, really, essentially, and to have the factory opened again, actually. And during his protests, which last for 400 days, I think, or something like that, or more than 300 days anyway, he gets very lonely up there because he's the only person on top of it, and he's sleeping in a tent, and he has tarpaulin around. It gets really cold in Korea in the winter time, and he's there during the winter and has a bit of frostbite after his stay there. But he gets kind of lonely, and he has these bottles lined up around the platform, and you could say that this is magical realism, but it also could just be the sort of mind wanderings of somebody who's suffering from isolation, essentially. And he has conversations with these bottles, and they become characters from his family or from his childhood, and ghosts, kind of. And he, through them, the story of his family spools out, or through him, you could say. He's a kind of conduit. And we learn about the family from early on in the 20th century, during after annexation with Japan, during the colonial era, and the struggles of the people then, mainly. And so there are two characters, Ichol and Ilchol brothers, who represent the two different paths of Korean citizens during the annexation, during the Japanese colonization. And one brother is very upstanding, and he studies hard, and he becomes a train driver, hence the train on the front of the book, and also because the transport network played a big part in the power of Japan over the mainland. It was a really important way to get around quickly and to transport goods around China and Manchuria and Korea. That brother follows that kind of conventional state-sanctioned sort of. He's a good citizen. He's a citizen. He's an upstanding citizen of the empire. Whereas, even though he's second class, and he can never get out of his second class position, because he is, even after he's changed his name, he is essentially Korean. But the other brother is much more revolutionary in his attitude towards Japan and Korea's position as an oppressed state, and more than anything, he sees this through a communist lens, a Marxist lens, even by his family for not following a safer and more conventional path. But he gets very involved in agitation and spreading propaganda against the capitalist and colonial power, and so we follow these two brothers and their family in general as they try to sort of navigate the challenges of living in that era. And really crucial for me to convey about this book is that as it goes on, we realize, I mean, it's implicit at the beginning, because even in contemporary times, Gino has to protest for his rights as a working class person in capitalist Korea, which is a really big, successful economy by some measures, but people are still really struggling for their survival. And then we go all the way back to the 1930s, and people are struggling then under different circumstances, but they, at the end of Japan's colonization of Korea, because the Allied powers have defeated the Axis powers, Japan leaves, and it essentially what happens is that there is a handover of the occupied state from Japan to the US, and there's one sentence at some point where the feeling of the realization of the Korean people that this isn't salvation, that liberation didn't feel like liberation, or something to that effect. It becomes clear then that, some things get worse under the US occupation, and then after the war, like during the war, that's a terrible situation for the Korean people. They suffer again, and then they suffer after the war because Korea is very poor and there's a dictatorship, and up in the north things don't turn out the way the communists wanted, and a lot of the communists, and then it takes a long, long time for Korea to get to a place where you could say it's a democracy, and even then there isn't an end to the suffering of the working class people. So really what you're left with at the end of the book is the sense that the thing that was oppressing them is not specifically the Japanese, it's not specifically the US, it's not specifically any single thing. It is except hierarchy and one group oppressing another group for their own advantage. You know, there's critics have said a few things about the book that I think are largely unfair. They've said that the historical material included in the book is presented, there's too much detail, it's presented in a dry fashion. I actually disagree with that. I think that a book like this is, you can't expect that it will read like a page turner, right? It is a world in like less than 500 pages, and all of that historical material adds richness to the context that the characters are in, and helps you almost embody one of them or be with them as they struggle. And you know, I got so wrapped up in their plight that I just lapped all of that stuff up. I wanted to know more and more about it. I wanted to know how the train engine worked. I wanted to know the speech given by the Japanese emperor, the sort of, not really the surrender speech, I suppose, but like the word surrender wasn't even used in it. I wanted to read all about the hypocrisy in it, and it felt like so much of it, reading all of that stuff, was placed so well. It felt like you could feel the knife going between the shoulder blades of the Korean people. Like, I cannot stress strongly enough how wrong those critics are. How they have misread, have they given an unfair reading of this book. Early on, I would say like a quarter in, I felt a little bit disappointed that I didn't feel more emotionally invested in the characters. But I was so wrong about that, because shortly after I made that judgment, I was crying then for like intermittently throughout the rest of the book, because I was so invested in their stories. As I mentioned in my TBR, I have spent time in Korea, and Korea still is very much connected to my life, and so that adds gravity to this read for me personally. But I would say that if you're interested in the history of Korea, or in class struggle, or in really harrowing human experiences and stories, or you know what, if you're interested in the meat and potatoes of life, and there's no fluff in this book, there's no frivolity. This is not really, I mean, like there's mirth between humans who are living under terrible circumstances, but this book is the real stuff of life, you know, the real stuff of what it is to be human. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I think it's the first book maybe this year, or the second, that got 5 out of 5 stars. Highly recommended. Matter 210, Hwang Sok-Yong. This got to the internet very late, this video, as a wrap-up, and I apologise for that. But it was an experiment, and what I learned was that TBRs are not really for me. And that's fine, and they're for others, and that's great. And I even watch other people's TBRs. But I don't think they're going to be part of what I do on this YouTube channel. Unlikely to be. Although this month I am reading the shortlist for the Arthur C. Clarke Award, so that's a kind of a TBR, and I will feel the pressure there because, you know, I'm really far behind. But I like the idea of supposedly Fun's alternative to the TBR, which he calls, I think, Pile of Possibilities, which is much more loose, and it's just like a pile of books there that you can draw from if you want, and if you don't want to, you don't have to. I do, however, feel the need now to stop buying books for obvious reasons, and start reading what's on my shelf, and not being so consumerist about my reading, because there are so many books I can get at the library. Like this one, for example, which is one of the shortlists for the Arthur C. McClarke Award shortlist. I have only read one thus far, and time is ticking, so also not all of the books become available to me in the library, so I'm not sure how I'm going to do. I'm going to go easy on myself, though. I do have people that I might disappoint, but not an awful lot, to be honest. I'm a very, very small YouTuber, so please bear with me, those few who do follow me. I am in the early stages of developing a YouTube channel, so I'm just sort of making up the rules as I go along, to be honest. To everybody who watched right through, thank you so much. I'm so happy to have you here, especially if you came back after my TBR to see my wrap-up. I hope that some of the books in this video might be to your taste, and if they are not, perhaps there are some that resemble them or surpass them and you'd like to recommend them in the comments. That would be really cool. And that's all for this video. Until the next one, stay well, stay curious, and stay reading.